really important. So, good evening and welcome. As most of you know, I'm Craig Snyder, the current president of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. And it is really a particular joy for me this evening to present this particular speaker from the Council's podium. Buntzie has been a dear friend and a crucial mentor of mine since the end of my freshman year in college, when she hired me to work one day a week writing scripts for her famous radio series, Worldviews, on the unfortunately late radio station WFLN-FM. I worked for Buntzie throughout college and then for a total of about 8 years during the following 10 years after I graduated from college. It was my privilege to assist her during one of the most intense and productive periods in the 70-year history of the World Affairs Council, with highlights including our presentation of President Reagan, Premier Gorbachev, and Prime Minister Thatcher. I had occasion to write at that time, in that period, that Buntzie did not simply run this place, she did so with imagination and guts. Buntzie was president of the Council from 1983 until 2006, and before that, she was executive director before she became president, and I think that started with the invention of the modern nation state in 1648. She did this incredible conference on the Treaty of Westphalia. It's amazing. During all of that time, while she introduced hundreds of speakers, including most of the world leaders of those decades, believe it or not, this is the first time that Buntzie has been a speaker in her own right at a council event, long overdue. Now, as Buntzie and I have discussed, one of the defining features of leaving this organization is that one no longer has to keep one's personal opinions to oneself. There is no such obligation in retirement or in other aspects of life. So tonight we get to hear Buntzie Ellis Churchill unplugged, free to speak her own mind on some very important and indeed some controversial questions of our time, questions about which she has devoted a great deal of scholarly efforts since leaving the World Affairs Council. So with that, please join me in welcoming Buntzie Ellis Churchill.
Thank you. I knew him when he was 18.
That was in 1649.
Right. I'm glad many of you are here, some of old friends, some new friends, and thank you for coming. My talk will be eye-opening, sobering, and for some, very depressing. I want to share with you some of my bona fides so you know something about my background on this subject. As an undergraduate and a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, my major was international relations, and I specialized in the Middle East. I have traveled extensively in the area, and through my work at the World Affairs Council, got to know a number of Middle Eastern leaders. Can you hear all right in the back? Mm-hmm. One of the most interesting was Muammar Gaddafi, with whom I spent several hours in his tent in the Libyan desert while he was being interviewed. I co-authored with the doyen of Middle East historians, Bernard Lewis, the well-reviewed book, Islam, the Religion, and the People. And speaking of Bernard Lewis, I've known him over 25 years, and we've had hundreds of meals together. So since his favorite subject is Islam and the Middle East, you could say I've become an expert once removed. In 2015 and 2016, Angela Merkel of Germany and other European leaders opened their borders to Syrian refugees, and a total of about 1.5 million unvetted Muslims entered Europe. However, only about 30% of them were in fact Syrian refugees. The other 70% were young men looking for work or for handouts. Some of the immigrants are entitled to chain migration, which brings in family members, and so more are expected. However, at this very time, with the tightening of borders, the immigration wave has subsided. There was little discussion at the time what this impact would be on Europe at the present time and what the future would bring. Immigration as a subject was cut off from normal political debate because if commentators were negative, they were immediately labeled racist or Islamophobic. There were about 1 million Muslims in Europe at the time before the influx. They came from the former European colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and they came in the years after World War II, when the population was aging and Europe needed workers. It was thought that the Muslims would integrate, and some did. In Britain, there are now 9 Muslim mayors, including the mayors of 3 large cities, London, Birmingham, and Leeds. And there are 26 Muslim members of parliament. There are also about 3,000 mosques, and all schools in Great Britain now serve only halal meat. That's the Arab equivalent of kosher. Germany brought in guest workers, who in turn brought about a slow Islamization of the country. In the main cities, mosques were built and Quranic schools were established. Unfortunately, the guests didn't leave, and there are now several generations of Turks in Germany, and they are still referred to as Turks. Even though they may be citizens of Germany, it only takes about 8 years to become a citizen of Germany, they cannot, of course, become ethnic Germans. An example of the impact of this is that an acquaintance of mine has lived in Germany for more than 35 years. For 30 of those years, he was a professor at a German university. He was a Syrian by birth. He was recently asked to speak at another German university, and he was introduced as a Syrian with a German passport. In the US, immigration does not threaten our national identity, nor does religious or ethnic pluralism. It does not matter from whom we are descended. The obligations of membership in the American community are to endorse its principles and its institutions, to speak its language, to obey its laws, and set aside prior political obligations that conflict with those of US citizenship. Ethnicity does not matter. One of the effects of modernization is the transition to the secular. Religion has become countercultural. You have to be raised in a religion to find it natural. And religion falls in popularity when it doesn't satisfy the needs as well as the secular alternatives. A recent French poll showed that 83% of young Muslims believe religion is very important, as contrasted with only 22% of young Catholics. European churches are empty. A French Christian journal recently wrote that soon, if you want to see Christianity in France, you will have to go to a museum. Now, what happened? 2 factors, among others, pulled the rug of theological certainty from under Europe's feet. An important one was 19th century Bible scholarship, which applied methods of history, philology, and literary criticism to sacred scripture, making it seem just a bit less sacred. And then in 1859 came the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, and the biblical view of creation was weakened by the theory of evolution. Some see in Europe a tiredness, a feeling that for Europe the story has run out. As well as losing faith in its beliefs, Europe has lost faith in some of its traditions, and witnessed the questions in the European Union about political, economic, and financial scope of the institution. And of course, you have Brexit. This feeling of running out of steam has happened at precisely the moment when a different society is moving in. A society of firm beliefs, of strength, of youth, and of fertility. After World War II, Europe settled on human rights as sort of the central meaning of their area. Political correctness became fashionable, in fact, de rigueur, and with it, multiculturalism, which can be seen as a vehicle for criticizing Western civilization, and the media joined in enthusiastically. A culture of complaint leads to a culture of blame, and there seems to be quite a bit of that going around. However, Islam has an immunity from criticism that Christianity has lost and Judaism never had. The word Islam means submission. When you say the word Islam, it covers more than 14 centuries of history, 1.3 billion people, and an enormous variety of cultural, linguistic, and even religious traditions. In Islam, there are a number of schools and sects with different doctrines and practices. We think of a nation subdivided into religions. They think of a religion subdivided into nations. Western and Islamic cultures, values, and mores are very different. And a basic key cultural difference between Islam and the West is that in the West, we have a duty-guilt culture. If I don't do my duty, I feel guilty. If I haven't done my duty, I feel worse. Islam has an honor-shame culture. It's external, whereas the duty-guilt culture is internal. It's what do I think? Their perception of honor and shame is external. What does he think of me? And if I or my family is dishonored, I feel shame. It's to restore honor that is the reason for honor violence against women. The values of the Muslims from the Middle East are different from those of the Judeo-Christian tradition in the West. A few examples. Tradition versus innovation. In Islam, tradition is sacred. Novelty is suspect. And so innovation as such is bad unless it can be proved to be good. And this perception was a serious obstacle to Middle Eastern modernization. You have loyalty versus nepotism. In Islamic cultures, if you hire your nephew, that's a very good thing. You're helping and supporting your family. In the West, if you hire your nephew, it's not so good. It's nepotism. Attitudes toward women are different. Polygamy versus monogamy. And regard for books is different. About 10 years ago, the UN Development Program sponsored several Arab Human Development reports. These reports provided leading Arab scholars a platform through which to analyze the challenges and for opportunities for development in the Arab region. One of these reports came up with a startling statistic. The cumulative total of translated books in the Arab world since the 9th century was about 100,000, approximately the number that Spain translates every year. Demography is destiny. A stable population needs a fertility rate of 2.1 children per woman. In the last more than 10 years, not one country in Europe has been at the 2.1 number. In France, it's 1.8. In the United Kingdom, 1.6. Germany, 1.4. And it's interesting that in the three most Catholic countries in Europe, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, the fertility rate is 1.2. In Northern Europe, one of the most popular names for boy babies is Mohammed. Among the reasons for the low European birth rate are the birth control pill and the legalization of abortion, both of which gave women choice and enabled women to become economically self-sufficient and independent. There's a difference, too, in when they have children. The Muslim women have children in their late teens or early 20s. The European, Western women have children generally in their mid to late 30s or early 40s. So already there is a difference in how these generations are developing. One factor that is very rarely talked about is cousin marriage, which Muhammad encouraged 50 generations ago. In the United Kingdom, Pakistanis are 3% of the population. But in one respect, because of cousin marriage, they account for 30% of birth defects, both mental and physical. In Middle Eastern countries, the number of cousin marriages varies between 40% and 70%. Given the aging population, the median age in Germany is 47, and the plummeting fertility rates, a replacement of the non-Muslim population with the Muslim population is taking place. Demographers say that in a number of countries, nationals will become a minority in their homelands within possibly 15 to 20 to 30 years. And Germany is one of those, and very much wants its Turks to integrate. But in 2011, President Erdogan of Turkey said to his compatriots, quote, "Yes, integrate yourselves into German society, but don't assimilate. No one has the right to deprive us of our culture and identity." Last year, Erdogan told the Turks living in the West, quote, "Go live in better neighborhoods, drive the best cars, make not 3, but 5 children, because you are the future of Europe." Humans and other life forms are generally programmed to procreate. Europeans have become the exception. Europe is committing demographic suicide, systematically depopulating itself in what historian Neil Ferguson has called the greatest reduction in European population since the Black Death in the 14th century. Unskilled workers from the Muslim world cannot replace skilled Germans who retire or die. According to Germany's Federal Labor Office, 2 million immigrants are now receiving unemployment benefits. Of this number, 1 in 4 is unemployable and not likely to acquire the skills that are necessary to earn a living in Europe. They will have to rely on government benefits for the rest of their lives. By the way, men with multiple wives get multiple benefits. The immigrants have a real impact on their new homeland. For example, budgets. Social welfare payments mount up. And in Sweden, refugees will cost over $18 billion this year, 9 times over what they had thought would be budgeted. Housing, to talk about Sweden again. Sweden built blocks of houses for pensioners. Pensioners will not get those apartments. They've been given to some of the refugees. Education. You have to teach the immigrants their new language. When the influx came in Germany, Angela Merkel put out a request for 20,000 new teachers of German. In Sweden, there's a new wrinkle. Not only do they teach the newcomers Swedish, but there's a new organization in Sweden called Young Sweden, which says, okay, you have wanted to teach us Swedish, now we want you to learn Arabic, and they offer Arabic classes. Public life has changed. For example, this past Christmas, in a Norwegian elementary school, prepared the usual Christmas pageant using biblical verses. But this time there was a new wrinkle. They added 2 verses from the Quran which spoke about Jesus. In healthcare, diseases that were nearly eradicated, such as tuberculosis and measles, have made a comeback. And hospitals have a challenge because Muslim women only want to be cared for by female doctors. Claims that the refugees would assimilate without major problems collided with reality. Crime rates are up dramatically. In 2016, almost half the crimes in Berlin were committed by the newcomers. Germany has a migrant rape crisis. Preliminary statistics show that migrants committed more than a dozen rapes and sexual assaults every day in 2017, a 4-fold increase since 2014. The director of the Criminal Police Association estimates that up to 90% of the sex crimes committed in Germany do not appear in official statistics. Many crimes are unreported or downplayed, apparently to avoid fueling anti-immigrant sentiments. Only the most sensational crimes are covered by the national media, none of which has connected the dots and reported the big picture. Police admit that they are outnumbered and overwhelmed and increasingly unable to maintain public order. By the way, Sweden had the second highest number of rapes in the world after South Africa, 6 times higher than the United States. And the Swedish solution is to distribute anti-rape wrist bracelets. In a number of European cities, Muslim ghettos have arisen. Some of these are called no-go zones, and they're places where it is dangerous for non-Muslims to go. And so police Firemen and emergency medical personnel stay away for self-preservation. In Sweden, there are 55 no-go zones. In France, about 750. And just several weeks ago, Angela Merkel, for the first time, admitted that there were, in fact, no-go zones in Germany. In reality, some of the no-go zones function like microstates and are governed by Islamic law. Islamic law, Sharia law, is a legal system derived from the Quran and the teachings of the Islamic scholars. Sharia law has become, in parts of Europe, a parallel legal system. There are German judges in German courts who cite Sharia law when judging cases involving Muslims. They quote from the Quran to uphold polygamy and the right of a husband to beat his wife or wives. In England, there are now 130 Sharia courts, and this means there are two legal systems functioning at the same time. Over 4,000 British Muslims go to these courts for arbitration in financial and marital disputes. The arbitration is conducted in accordance with the principles of the faith. But the procedures of these courts present problems. The presiding judges are imams, and there is no agreed upon selection process based on credentials or experience. There is little access to legal representation for defendants and no right of appeal. Some of the rulings of the Sharia courts are contrary to the law of the land, particularly with respect to women. In the Quran, it says a woman is worth half a man, in testimony, in inheritance, and in damage compensation. And the violations of women's rights include child marriage, polygamy, honor violence, and female genital mutilation. In their rulings, these courts discriminate against women, and in truth, justice is denied. One example. Last year in Britain, there were over 5,000 new cases of female genital mutilation that they know about. Female genital mutilation was banned in the United Kingdom in 1985, 33 years ago. But in all that time, not one person has been convicted of that crime. All Britain would have to do is enforce its own laws. But it is important to know that genital mutilation and honor killings are not part of Sharia. One cannot criticize Islam for the practices of the tribes who adopted it, even though now some of these practices are to a greater or lesser extent become part of Middle Eastern culture. Another challenge that is a troubling development is that there has been a large rise in anti-Semitism. A European Union study found that 4 out of 5 Swedish Jews declined to publicly identify themselves as Jews. In Britain, between 2014 and 2016, there was a 45% increase in anti-Semitic crime. But no other country in Europe has experienced as many attacks against Jews as in France. Because of bullying and harassment, more than 60% of Jewish children in France have to go to French schools instead of public schools. And in the last decade, 40,000 Jews have left France, and in the last 3 years, 20,000 of those immigrated to Israel. In Germany, a study by the government revealed that 40% of the country's population, that is almost half, agree with Israel-centered anti-Semitism. The very word Jew is now a generic form of abuse in German schoolyards. And this new generation of anti-Semites knows the laws and juggle around legal loopholes to express their views. That's why some in Berlin brought a homemade Israeli flag to burn at a protest. They will probably avoid jail time because in court it may be proven that it was not an exact Israeli flag. An important element of Islam to a minority of Muslims is jihad. The definition of jihad in the Venerable Encyclopedia of Islam simply states, the spread of Islam by arms is a religious duty upon Muslims in general, and jihad must continue to be done until the whole world is under the rule of Islam. We have witnessed terrorist attacks in New York, Brussels, London, Birmingham, Manchester, Paris, and last summer in Barcelona. A frequent thread in the media coverage of mass murder attacks is an accompanying analysis of the phrase Allahu Akbar, which terrorist perpetrators often shout. The New York Times, for example, commented on the use of this phrase by saying, quote, Allahu Akbar has somehow become inextricably intertwined with terrorism. Its real meaning is far more innocent, end quote. That's a classic example of political correctness, because what the phrase Allahu Akbar actually means is that Allah is great, and the implication being greater than any other God. And when recited, it empowers Muslims, making them feel superior. When the number of Muslims rises, that minority that believe in Islamic jihad also rises, and the likelihood of experiencing jihadist attacks rises as well. A new challenge is that some of the Europeans who went to the Middle East to join ISIS have now come back. In 2017, there were 24 jihadist attacks in Europe. Islamists who are caught go to prison, but given the length of their sentences, 60% of convicted jihadists will be released in less than 3 years. After the attack on a pedestrian thoroughfare in Barcelona this past summer, the leading Spanish newspaper, El País, ran an editorial that said, radicalization is the bitter fruit of the exclusion of certain communities, and added that the answer was more social justice. German Chancellor Angela Merkel issued a brief reproach about a revolting event, and she expressed solidarity with the Spanish people and then moved on. The French President, Emmanuel Macron, tweeted a message of condolence and spoke of a tragic attack. Many leaders treat Islamic terrorism as a fact of life that Europeans must get used to, as if it's some kind of aberration unrelated to Islam. This is a poster that appears throughout central London. It was prepared by the Metropolitan Police. It says, run to a place of safety. This is a better option than to surrender or negotiate. Hide. Turn your phone to silent and turn off the vibrate. Barricade yourself if you can. And call the police at 999 when it is safe to do so. This is in the tube trains and in various shops, and it's prevalent in central London. Submission reigns. The discourse everywhere says that despite increasing threats, Europeans must live their lives as normally as possible. But Europeans see insecurity everywhere. They see policemen and soldiers in the streets, proliferating security checks. There are strict controls at the entrance to theaters and shops. They are told to ignore the source of the threats. Many Europeans are afraid of the changes to their freedoms that could be imposed by the culture and beliefs of this new, large, non-European group. Even though the newcomers are a minority, they can have a disruptive influence, especially if they resist social integration and intolerance for the laws of their host country. A recent poll of British Muslims illuminates the view of some. Half would outlaw homosexuality. 1/3 would legalize polygamy. And 1/5 would replace civil law with Sharia law. What's mystifying is the state of denial that infects most of Europe's elites, but not the people. According to a recent poll, 76% of Europeans disapprove of the way their leaders have handled the immigration crisis. In frontline countries like Greece and Italy, 90% disapprove. This past December in Austria, Sebastian Kurz, age 31, became the world's youngest head of state. Although he leads the center-right party, which has been in power for 30 years, Mr. Kurz, known in Austria as Buntzie, which means whiz kid, ran on an anti-immigration platform. He formed a coalition with the anti-immigration, right-wing, anti-Semitic Freedom Party, and their proposals include requiring immigrants to learn German, reducing welfare benefits for new immigrants, speeding asylum decisions. Chancellor Kurz will convene a European Union summit meeting on immigration in the second half of this year. Let's hope that it generates some doable ideas. Thank you. I'm going to go that way.
Okay.
Age is telling it. Oh, I'll never forget when a speaker moved the chair and slipped off. When your mark gets set.
Okay, there you go.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so just a couple of questions from me, and then we'll open to this fine audience. Okay, so if someone could dial back to the heyday of American open immigration in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there were lots of native-born Americans who looked at the immigrant populations of Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, including the Jewish population, as a threat to national identity, and who looked at those folks as being unemployable, unassimilatable, because they did not come from the traditions of Northern Europe. Those people were wrong, right?
They were indeed.
Our families, and many millions of others, were able to assimilate, and within a generation, become very productive, contributing Americans. Clearly, the view that you've expressed indicates a belief that that is not going to happen with the Muslim immigrants to Europe. What is, in your view, the fundamental difference in those situations?
I think one of the fundamental differences is that the Europeans or the immigrants, by the way, the reason the first immigrants came from Northern Europe was because of the size of the boats. It's a shorter distance. It was when they had bigger boats that they were able to come from the Mediterranean. But one of the differences is that those people who came wanted to become American. They were leaving behind a culture and a society that had not been very good to them. And they wanted to be there. They wanted their children to learn English. They wanted them to get educated. And even with the Irish population, which took a longer time to completely integrate, nevertheless, still wanted to be here because they wanted to be American. It's interesting, one of the differences in terms of power is that for many of these immigrant groups, they made money first and then got power. Whereas within the Middle Eastern community, you get power first, and through that you make money. And so it's a very different sort of way of going about it. But many of these immigrants really don't want to be German. They want to earn a living and send it home to their families back in wherever. And it's a different feeling. They also, I think, Islam is incredibly important to the believers, and so that becomes a very key part of their living, and other things will take a secondary place to that. They pray 5 times a day, and they abide by the faith. Whereas I think in America it was different. You went to church on Sunday, but your job, your family came first.
Let's talk about the demographics a little bit. So in all developed societies, not just the West, certainly including Japan, economic development has been accompanied by a declining birth rate. In fact, declining below replacement rate.
Yep.
So the societies, the populations of every developed country, absent immigration, are going to decline.
Correct.
In this century. The Chinese population is also going to decline in the second half of the century because of the generation that was prohibited from having more than one child. So some people look at the immigrants as not the problem or the threat, but as the demographic salvation, because otherwise you have a society that is aging in an unprecedented way historically, and where the absolute population is declining. So that's sort of one half of the question. The other half of the question is, trend is not destiny, right?
That's true.
So isn't it likely, given everything we know about the demographics of the last century, isn't it likely that the Muslim population of Europe will have declining birth rates as they come to live in a truly modern
Well,
society?
as their economic situation increases, yes, there will be declining birth rates. This is so politically incorrect for me to say, but if you look at the countries of the Middle East, do you want to replicate some of those cultures in Europe? What are the values? Will they bring with them those values and want to keep those values as opposed to picking up the values of their new countries? And I think there will be there's no question, a number of them will, of course, integrate into the society. There are, I think, 6 Muslim members of the German parliament. They will become part. I mean, how many places can you get Middle Eastern shawarma or, that's fine. But the question is what will happen with the majority and how will it influence and impact the culture that is already there. We've seen what happens when you have extremists, and granted they are a minority, but they pull down structures that they don't like. I mean, we've had mosques brought down, mosques that were really wonderful and part of their history and culture, and they blow them up. So I don't think, is that going to happen a lot? I don't know. But the point is that I look at the Middle East, and I have traveled, I've been in 7 Middle Eastern countries, and often as a guest of the government, so I saw some stuff I often saw on my own. I don't think some of that is good to be replicated in Europe. And it really depends on the attitude of the people. Do they want to become European? Or do they want to just have a job and keep the culture that they've got? It's a tough situation. But the demographics will change.
Okay, one more question about, sort of based on historical metaphor, right? You said that a minority of European Muslims are jihadis, but that as the number of Muslims in total rises, so will the size of that minority. Isn't that the same thing as saying that the more Italian Americans came to the United States in the 1880s, 1890s, meant that the minority that were in the mafia was inevitably going to go up? And
it's not one of my areas of specialization. And for a while it did, until they got caught on tax problems. I mean, at one point the mafia was pretty big and pretty powerful. Hopefully no longer, but I don't know.
okay. All right, I'm going to take some questions from out here, please.
Thank you. By the way, superb presentation. Thank you for giving it. You had indicated that the United States is not going to be facing the same problems as in Europe. If you were to give your presentation to University of Penn's English department, their law school, to Yale, to Princeton, the places that are training the elites, how many seconds would you speak before you'd be shut down? And by the way, could you tell us something about assimilation being racist? In the United States we're talking about here, this is what we hear. Assimilation being racist, white guilt, it looks like the choices between the Nazis and the far left are around here. So could you please?
No. Look at my age. So I am not part of the culture that is extreme in one place or another. I mean, what's happening to Amy Wax at the University of Pennsylvania Law School is outrageous. Look up the name Amy Wax and you'll see this. I mean, you talk about the University of Pennsylvania or the English department. Now this to me is nuts. The English department took down a picture of Shakespeare in the hallway and replaced it with the picture of a not terribly well-known black female writer. I have nothing against black female writers, but in lieu of Shakespeare, why not just next to? But that's what they do. I think some of that stuff is nuts.
That's an understatement.
Okay, why don't we just go, we'll go from front to back. We did the first row, please. We'll
So
start with
let's
this
start
lady.
ladies
Yeah.
first.
I'm just wondering, you mentioned that many of the immigrants, there are families that made it with great hardship and so forth, but many of the Middle Eastern immigrants were men by themselves. And-
Young men,
Yeah.
rural,
I know. So
frustrated.
is that part of the problem?
yes indeed, with the
Is that-
rapist culture, it absolutely
Yeah,
is.
because many of the immigrants here in years past, brought brides en masse, there were picture brides and things like that.
Yeah,
to
certainly.
address the imbalance.
Can you hear what she said?
No,
That
no.
in the past, young men came and they married here, or they found women, or there were pictures that were shown, and marriages were arranged,
And women were brought over.
and women were brought over. Marriages are still being arranged with some of the Middle Eastern cultures. I have a friend whose family wanted her to marry somebody that they chose in Pakistan. Now, she resisted, but that's still part of the culture. But you have these men who have come in the last 2 years, and they think of the non-Muslim women as easy meat. They're wearing short skirts, they're out without a male protector, and you have a real rape problem. I mean,
Now, should there be a social policy to encourage marriage and somehow find brides for these folks?
I would want to have to, yes, of course, you want to encourage them to settle down, to want to raise a family. But on the rape issue, I will tell you about the town of Rotherham, which is in Yorkshire. For several years, there was a group of what they called Asians. Most of them were Pakistanis, who were taxi drivers. And they ended up grooming, I don't know where this word came from, but it means giving them drugs and liquor and so forth. 1,400 young girls were raped and then passed around in this group. This is over several years. And the shocking thing was that the police and the social welfare agencies knew about it, but they didn't do anything about it because they didn't want to be called racist. And it was finally an academic woman wrote a paper about it, which the newspapers then picked up, and so it got exposed. But it was really unbelievable. Women girls as young as 11, between ages 11 and 14, were part of this group.
We have enough demographic data in America to foresee the decline of the Caucasians versus non-Caucasians in the total population in a period of time. Is there such a sign of a country at risk of that in Europe, particularly at risk in a certain period of time?
Sure. Particularly in Eastern Europe and in like the Baltic countries, where they really haven't admitted these immigrants. The Baltic countries have Muslims that came from Russia, from the Stans. But a place like Hungary has absolutely closed its border. Viktor Orban does not want Muslims coming in. One of the reasons may be that they were under the Ottoman Empire, and they don't want to repeat that experience. But they have problems. They have an elderly population. They need people to help care for those folks, and they don't have them. And so they're turning schools into hospice residences. It's a real problem. What's going to happen? Who knows? I certainly don't know. I mean, you can only think of what happened after the Black Death, that finally the population rose, and what it did do was, what the Black Death did was get rid of serfdom.
Please.
You see, I really appreciate the talk, bringing the topic on the front. The core of the conflict is the Sharia and the Quran. If you take away the two words, there is no Sharia and there is no Quran, all of a sudden a lot of problems will shrink. You see, this violence is rooted in the faith, and the faith they reinforce. This is the only way to live, and that's where the problem. But whatever you have said is so factual, but in Europe or now or historically, they knew all these things. These are simple.
Well, you would have thought they would have. What he was saying, if for those of you who didn't hear, is that without Sharia and the faith in the Quran, you wouldn't have these problems. Well, that's true, but unfortunately, that's not going to go away. And you would have thought that the European leaders might have thought through some of the implications. I think this may, in fact, change. There have been discussions of paying the people to go back to where they came from or some other country. I don't know that that has worked. They seem to come back again. There are holding places, holding camps now in Libya and someplace else in the Middle East, where so they don't let the refugees come across. They sort of feed them and take care of them in the Middle East. And that, in fact, may be part of the solution. If some of these Middle Eastern countries, particularly the wealthier ones, admit some of these Muslims. Hasn't happened yet, but it may.
There was one over here on the wall? No? Okay, change mine. Sir?
Yes, all the issues talk about the assimilation of the Muslims and other folks from the Middle East. Did that play a part in Brexit?
Oh, sure it did. He asked, did that play a part in the vote on Brexit? Yes. England has tried very hard not to have some of these migrants come in. They have their own Muslim population, the Pakistanis, and they're dealing with them. That seems to be pretty stable. But they amass in Calais, I think, and trying to get through the channel, and it's a problem. I mean, England doesn't want any more.
Please, in the middle there. Yes.
Hello. What would you recommend is the most authentic, reliable, trustworthy source of news for this and other issues?
Oh, that's a loaded topic. What would I recommend as source of news? My best recommendation, because the World Affairs Council is nonpartisan, to read a variety of stuff. If you read the New York Times, then take a look at the Wall Street Journal. Perfectly reasonable balance. For some of the statistics that I cited, it's hard to find those. And I like reading I'm on the mailing list of a place called the Gatestone Institute. And Gatestone seems to be somewhat radical, but I haven't found them yet to be wrong. Your sort of instinct is, is that true? But I don't know how to counter it. You really have to read widely. I wouldn't recommend Breitbart, but there are really tons of places. I read the London Times, The Guardian. Unfortunately, my French isn't good enough to read some of those papers in the real. But you have to look at a variety and sort of, if you take a topic and follow it through, Google works. Especially if you get down to numbers 3 or 4 or 5, you find out some interesting stuff.
Sir?
With the demographic issue, I looked at a book that when you were president, we had Pete Peterson here, and he had a book great on, and the declining birth rates in all of those.
Well, that was a long time ago.
It was, wasn't it?
He died recently.
Right.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, died
Yes, he was about 90.
Contributed to the demographic problem.
Yeah. But people have been writing about it, but it seems like the West doesn't do anything about it. Is there anything being discussed?
I don't see it. I was shocked. I mean, I would ask you, you are a sophisticated, reasonably read group of people who follow some international stuff. How many of you are aware of the demographic issues in Europe? Oh my God, you're terrific. I have spoken to audiences, I've given this talk a number of times, where there was no comprehension of what I'm talking about. So there's a real difference between those who seek out the information or who read about it, but I think it's really sort of shocking that there is so little understanding. And by the way, Toby, there are books, a couple of books on this that are good. I happen to like a guy named Douglas Murray, but who's very strong in his feelings. You have to sort of temper this, find who articulates his point of view well, and then find somebody on the other side. Please, our students.
Yep, one of our students here. Please.
While you were talking, you were like interchangeably using Arab and Muslim. So my question is, do you think the problem is Arabs or Muslims?
That's a very good question. The question is that I almost did interchangeably use the word Arab and bystand and Muslim. Arab culture is they're almost all Muslims, the Arabs, and they are in the Middle East. But not all Middle Eastern countries are Arab. The Persians are Persian, and the Turks are Turks. They are not Arab, but they are Muslim. So you have, Muslim is the religion. The Arab is, how do you define it? Tribal? It's an ethnic identity. You have lots of Muslims in Asia, in China, in the west part of China, in Xinjiang province, in Indonesia. They are not Arab. But they are Muslim. It is their religion. And there are differences in the various communities as to how they handle their religion. In the Middle East, they're basically tribal. Even though these countries, have somebody in Europe took a straight line on a ruler and made the border, and that doesn't work very well. But yet, you're right. It's a mistake that I made because I am talking mostly about the Middle East. I'm not talking about Pakistan. Well, a little bit of Pakistan when Pakistanis come to Europe, not Pakistanis in Pakistan, and certainly not about Indonesia or some of the other countries that have Muslims. But it's a good question. Thank you for asking it. Anton? Oh, Anton, I'm sorry. There's a question in the back, please.
Buntzie, it's not so much a question. It's sort of two observations. One has to do with your remark about the integration of the earlier comers to the United States and the degree to which they wanted to immigrate, to assimilate. But I think that there's a factor here that we're discounting, which is that we don't know how those early immigrants would have responded had they had Al Jazeera television, because the thing that I find so interesting about the problem is that it's possible for a variety of groups, but it seems to be particularly noticeable in the Muslim community, to live in the bubble, because you can come here. I mean, remember, it's not just in Europe. Remember the Boston Marathon bombing. I mean, those were Muslim Chechens,
Yep.
and they were watching TV from their home country all the time. So, there's the capacity to immure yourself that seems to spawn this.
Well, it encourages it, living in the bubble. But most of the ethnic people who came to the United States maintained their bubble for a generation or two, and then it was slowly gone. How many second or third generations Jews still speak Yiddish, or the Italians? It disappears. By the way, Toby, back to your question about what to read. If you want to read about America, there is a wonderful book called Ethnic America by Thomas Sowell, who is a professor at Stanford, and he has individual chapters on the different groups' experience when they came to America. The Chinese, the Jews, the Germans, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Irish. It is the best summary of what happened with each individual ethnic group. Ethnic America. I recommend it very, very highly. Yes, please. Oh, I'm sorry, Anton, you had your hand up before?
Well, I just had a quick observation question. Why are we not seeing that heavy Muslim immigration to America that's happened in Europe?
Because it's harder to get here.
Prior to 2 years ago.
Okay, but it's harder to get here. It's not a simple boat trip from Libya to the island of Lampedusa. So it's tougher. But there are some who come through the southern border. Getting into Canada is tougher. I tell you, I have a couple who are Iraqi, and I asked them how did they happen to come. and they're well educated. He said they went first to New Zealand. I said, how did that happen? He said, well, they were waiting for the lottery for America. But to get into New Zealand, there is a checklist that you have to fill out. So, and there are points. How educated are you? Are you young enough? Do you have children? What are the, and it really sounded, I must say, I went to the New Zealand website and tried to get through the paper, and it was hard to find what exactly did you need. I wasn't going to spend a couple hours doing that, but they then won the lottery, literally, and came to the United States. And I just had to hear one funny thing. I took them out to dinner at the Union League, and there's a picture in one of the dining rooms there of an odalisque. It's a very sort of Middle Eastern looking thing. It's a woman lying on a divan, and the man looked at it and he stared at it, and he said, "What? He keeps staring at this sort of half-nude woman." What he was looking at is that the decoration around the frame was in Arabic, and what it said is, "There is no God but Allah and Muhammad." And they did it this way, and then they did it this way, and it was very much in the Arab artistic something where they used calligraphy and representation. But I went to the general manager and said, "Are you aware of this?" And he said, "Not at all." That's a great picture, and the frame is very attractive. But it took an Iraqi immigrant to tell us what was really going on. I think we have time for one more, two more.
Let's just do one more. I'm going to defer to our high school student again, if I can.
Yes, by the way, you should all know that the council has this wonderful program for high school students and junior high school students.
Yes.
And it is run by Denise Bala, who is right here, doing a terrific job. And I'll tell you, that's how I got my start. I was in the World Affairs Club because I missed an English test. And she said, if you go to the World Affairs Club and go to their Saturday morning forum, you don't have to take the test. What would you do? I went and I got hooked. And one of my favorite lines ever is in graduate school, a foreign student said to me, "What are you going to do after you have studied international relations for 5 years? Are you going to become a diplomatrix?" Did you have a question?
So far that troublesome immigrants are concerned, from long tradition, there are a lot of Japanese, a lot of Chinese, a lot of non-Muslim others.
Very true.
You never have heard of a problem. So the problem, it should be defined very clearly. You say Islamic, Quranic.
I tried to do that.
And that's the issue.
There are
It
other...
doesn't matter what the ethnicity is.
Yes, you're absolutely right. It doesn't matter what your ethnicity is when you come to the United States. You don't hear that Japanese do this, except they know how to handle chopsticks a lot better than we do. Or the Chinese doing that. That's what's, I think, is so wonderful about America. You have all these people contributing all of their backgrounds, and it's...
But even in Europe, there are a lot of the Chinatown all over.
There are Chinatowns, and there are certainly curries
5 generations.
everywhere. But I'm sorry to get back to the student.
Oh, you didn't answer my
Please stand up.
previous question.
What?
You didn't answer my previous question.
I didn't?
No.
Between Islam and Muslims and Arabs?
I was asking, are you saying that the problem in Europe is a result of Muslims coming in or Arabs?
No, in this case, it's both, because the Muslims are coming generally from the Middle East, some from Africa, but not very many, but mostly it's Middle East. Look, they started coming in because of the Syrian civil war, and that was 30%, but then there were others who came. They came from Libya, they came from sub-Saharan Africa, but that's where they're coming from, and they are Muslim. So does that answer your question? Thanks.
But the problem is not because they're coming from the Middle East, the problem is because they're Muslim.
The problem
That's
is,
the answer to it.
well, that's very true. That it's the Muslim problem when they get to Europe, because they're not assimilating. They in a way they don't have the same constraints. These young men don't have the same constraints that they do. One of the reasons there are lots of crimes is that they don't fear the police. The police in their own home countries are much tougher on lawbreakers than they are in Europe. And believe jihadists don't get out of jail in less than 3 years, which,
Oh, they kill it.
exactly right, yeah. Any
We're going to leave it there. Thank you, Buntzie. Thank you, all of you.